Morning. This morning we're going to have a look at Hebrews chapter 11. Now, if Hebrews chapter 11 seems like a lot, contains a lot to deal with in one Sunday morning message, don't worry, we're only going to look at the first 39 verses. However, it does seem a little bit like being between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, either you take the approach of skimming across the top, or you pick out something to focus on and ignore the rest. So, to me, frankly, I don't know which is worse. But please feel free afterwards to tell me which one I did and how badly I did it. I'm going to pick out several phrases from the chapter for us to think about. I sometimes do this myself when I'm reading the Bible, just pick out a phrase to meditate on. And the first phrase consists of the first three words of the chapter. Now faith is. Now faith is. What a great way to start the chapter. How many times throughout history have we struggled to define exactly what faith is? And now the writer of Hebrews is going to tell us. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. At first glance, to me, it doesn't seem like this helps us very much in trying to define exactly what faith is. So maybe we need to look a bit closer. This verse links faith with two other things. The first one is hope. Now, the word hope in the Bible goes well beyond our modern usage of the word, which really doesn't mean a whole lot more than wishing for something and hoping that it's going to happen without any kind of certainty attached. But Peter says we have a living hope, by which he means Jesus. And now that I've mentioned his name, I should say that the theme of this message this morning is supposed to be Jesus is a better object of our faith. And the object of our faith makes all the difference, doesn't it? I mean, in my opinion, people who fly airplanes into skyscrapers must have a lot of faith. But it's not the faith in the right thing. The writer of Hebrews uses the word sure in relation to the hope that we have. We have a conviction that what we hope for will happen. The other thing that faith is linked to in this verse is sight, or actually a lack of sight, certain of what we do not see. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 states it even more clearly when it says, we live by faith and not by sight. Now, one might think that this is counterproductive. Surely it would be easier for people to believe in God if he gave us more physically visible signs. And yet the Old Testament shows us otherwise. There was no lack of visible evidence of God's presence or his power in the nation of Israel, but it didn't seem to help them very much in their relationship with God. And the story that Jesus told of the rich man and Lazarus is even more startling. When the rich man said that someone rising from the dead would convince people to repent, Jesus said what has to be one of the most astonishing statements in the New Testament. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. Really? Really? As startling as that statement is, I think it gives some valuable insight into two things. One is human nature, and the other is faith. We are not the very logical creatures that we like to think we are. Very often we are driven by our emotions, feelings, and desires rather than what makes the most sense. We actually do some very foolish things, financially, relationally, health-wise, and especially spiritually. Why is this? Because we want to. We want to. Why do people buy lottery tickets? Because they want to win. Do you know what the odds are against winning when you buy lottery tickets? Actually, it's one of my pet peeves, going into a convenience store and standing up waiting to be checked out, and someone's there buying all these tear-off tickets and tearing them off and throwing them in the waste paper basket. I just feel like saying, look, we could really save ourselves some time here. You give me your money, I'll tear it up, throw it in the garbage, and we can just move on, right? But the same applies to belief. People can believe the most ridiculous things, as we see all the time with conspiracy theories and propaganda. And the converse is also true. Many times people will not believe something simply because they don't want to believe it. Faith in what the Bible says is very logical when you consider things like creation, the existence of both good and evil, and even our own conscience. On the other hand, faith in something like evolution, for example, at least in its purest form, is quite illogical, not only considering the spiritual side, but also in terms of known science. The truth is, all people have faith. All people have faith. You show faith when you board an airplane. Do you know how many things can go wrong mechanically, electrically, hydraulically, or humanly from the time you take off and the time you land? My apologies if you're getting on a plane tomorrow. But then the same is true of getting excuse me, of getting into your car or having an operation. This summer, I drove my cousin to the hospital to have cataract surgery and lens replacement. How much faith does it take to sit in a chair and have someone shoot a laser into your eye? So when Paul said we live by faith and not by sight, although he was speaking about spiritual things, in another sense, he was actually stating something that's true of all people. But if Hebrews 11 verse 1 tells us that, number one, faith is being sure of what we hope for, and number two, faith is being certain of what we do not see, verse 6 tells us something else that faith is. Faith is a choice. Faith is a choice. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Now I know that Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8 tells us that faith is a gift, and so it is. But if we're going to argue one of these points against the other, then we're going to find ourselves in conflict with the Bible, because the Bible teaches both are true. Faith is not only a gift, it's also a choice. If you look at the list of people mentioned in Hebrews 11, people like Noah and Abraham and Moses, these people acted in certain ways because they had chosen to believe what God had said. They are the examples that the writer of Hebrews gives us to illustrate his point in verse 6. If you want to single out one thing that was most significant in God creating mankind, I think it has to be this. God gave man the freedom to choose. The freedom to choose. Not only choice of action, but also choice of belief. Genesis 3 shows us that mankind's first sin was actually the sin of unbelief. They chose not to believe what God had said about eating that fruit. And so Hebrews 11 verse 6 actually tells us the very first thing we can and must do to please God is to believe what he says. Just imagine having the ability at our disposal to please the God of the universe simply by believing what he says. And contrast that for a moment with the innumerable quantity of things that people have done for the last 6,000 years to appease or find the approval of their gods. Today you can please God just by choosing to believe that he exists and to believe what he says. It really doesn't seem like asking very much, does it? Second phrase I'd like to look at is this: by faith. By faith. That's probably no surprise, considering that the phrase is repeated 20 times in the chapter. What exactly does it mean to live by faith? I'm going to suggest that it means at least three things. The first thing that living by faith means is to believe, as we've already touched on briefly. But listen to these words from John chapter 6. Then they asked him, "What must we do to do the works that God requires?" Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." Now, Jesus wasn't saying that action is not important. Not at all. Far from it, as we will see. But he was making the point that action is not the starting point. It's rather the effect part of the equation, cause and effect. The cause part is to believe. This is the foundation, the beginning, the starting point. I've said that faith is a choice, and this is actually self-evident in the fact that all evangelistic preaching is, or should be, urging people to make the choice to believe. Not to mention the fact that the church has historically called Christians believers and non-Christians non-believers. Hebrews chapter 3 talks a lot about unbelief, going so far as to say that the Israelites were not able to enter the promised land specifically because of their unbelief. Now, there's no question that various factors come into play when it comes to believing. Factors like background, experience, circumstances, and personality. Some people seem to find it easier to believe than others. And we all fluctuate in our faith to one degree or another at different times. I think of one disciple who throughout church history has carried the title Doubting Thomas. I don't think he was so very different from us. And I sincerely hope that's not the way he gets introduced to us in heaven. I hope he's just introduced as Tom. Otherwise, I shudder to think how I might get introduced. I think we can all echo the words of the Father mentioned in Mark chapter 9 when he said to Jesus, "I do believe. Help my unbelief. Help me to overcome my unbelief." God knows all these things. He knows us individually, and he meets us where we are. But we're still called to exercise faith and to believe. The second thing that living by faith means is to act. Listen to what Hebrews 11 tells us. By faith Noah built an ark. By faith Abraham obeyed and went. By faith Moses' parents hid him. By faith Rahab welcomed the spies. Cause brings about effect, or at least it should. Belief should prompt us to act. James talks about the contradiction of faith minus action and calls it a dead faith. He goes even further to say that belief in God by itself doesn't even distinguish us from demons, which is pretty strong language. But the crux of what he says is in this: show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. A property in Newfoundland with a small cottage on it. It's the property where my father grew up, and we used to spend all our summers there when we were growing up. There was an apple tree there, or at least it looked like an apple tree, but for most of my lifetime it never produced a single apple. I felt like saying to it, "You call yourself an apple tree? Prove it. Prove it." One year, my daughter Kezia and I planted another small apple tree right next to that one. It proved to be quite an interesting tree by itself, but that's a different story. After a year or so, the little tree produced a few apples, and lo and behold, the next year, the old tree produced apples. I couldn't believe it. 50 years, and not a single apple. And now every year, it produces apples. Now, of course, we know about things like cross-pollination, things like that, which may account for it. But the point is this: that tree could insist all it wanted to that it was an apple tree. Until it produced an apple, there was no proof. James says, how do you show that you're a Christian? Where's the proof? But why do we need proof? We don't need to prove it to God. He knows if we have real faith or not. We don't need to prove it to each other. Ultimately, we don't answer to one another. But we do need to prove it to ourselves. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. In 1986, I was graduating from a technical school, and because of the good results, I was interviewed by one of the professors for an article in the school paper. The expectation was that now I would be going out into the workforce to get a good job and maybe rise to the top of my profession or something like that. Instead, I told them that Hazel and I were going as volunteers on a 72-year-old missionary ship to take the message of Jesus to people. I really felt sorry for him. because he had to try and somehow put this into the school paper. But why were we doing this? Why? Because belief prompted us to act. And Hebrews 11 gives us a long list of people whose faith prompted them to act accordingly. How crazy did people think Noah was? If you read the first chapters of Genesis carefully, then you can see that as far as we know, it had never even rained up until that point in history. And how crazy did Abraham's family think that he was in leaving everything? He came from a well-to-do family, and archaeological excavations show us that he came from an upscale area. How crazy did Joseph look to believe in a dream of prosperity when all his circumstances showed the exact opposite? And that brings us to the third thing that living by faith means: to trust. To trust. Now, if trust seems a lot like believe, I agree that there's certainly an overlap, but I also think there's another element. Belief relates largely to the mind, while trust relates more to the heart. And I'm not talking about the physical, I'm talking about the spiritual element. Proverbs 3 says to trust in the Lord with all your heart, which is not to ignore the mind, but to supplement it. If we wanted to describe trust, it's probably best described in terms of a deep-seated peace, a peace that Philippians 4 says transcends all understanding. Transcend is a good word in this context. The dictionary defines the word like this: to be or go beyond the range or limits of. In other words, trust doesn't ignore or reject the mind, but it goes beyond the limits of how far our minds can take us. And that's why we can have peace despite our circumstances. So living by faith means to believe, to act, and to trust. This is what we see in the lives of those listed in Hebrews chapter 11. Now, the third and last phrase I'd like for us to consider is taken from verse 32, and it's this: what more shall I say? You may be looking at your watches and wondering the same thing. I'm really glad the chapter didn't end at verse 31 for three reasons. First, if it did, I think it might be a bit intimidating. After all, how many of us would put ourselves in association with people like Enoch or Noah or Abraham? But verse 32 gives us a very different list. People like Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. And what makes them different? Well, if you read their stories, you will see that although they do exhibit an element of faith, their lives are not exactly the shining examples that you would necessarily want to imitate. In fact, some of them really blew it big time. Which reminds us that the kingdom of God is not all made up of people whose lives are what we might call success stories. Quite the opposite, which the following verse expresses well. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Hebrews 11 may well be called the faith chapter, but it could just as easily be called the grace chapter. These people will not be on display in some hall of fame in heaven. They will be on display in the hall of grace. And it's grace that makes it possible for us to say in verse 39 that these were all commended for their faith. Not some, but all. And the second reason I'm glad the chapter didn't end in verse 31 is because while verses 33 to 35 give illustrations of the great victories that God has given to his people, the middle of verse 35 to verse 38 again gives us a very different list. It's a list of those whose lives didn't have a happy ending, as we might say. But that doesn't mean their lives were not a success. As verse 35 says, they have gained a better resurrection. And what better definition of success could you want than that? And the third reason is another phrase that appears in verse 34, whose weakness was turned to strength. We will never get a good grasp of the Christian life unless we understand that principle. Paul outlines it again in 2 Corinthians 12 when he gives us God's reply to Paul's request for his thorn in the flesh to be removed. My power is made perfect in weakness, to which Paul adds this, for when I am weak, then I am strong. King David understood this principle, as we see in his statement concerning the murder of Abner at the hands of David's own unscrupulous commander, Joab. And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. If Jesus is a better object of our faith, then he also gives us the perfect example of this principle, because as it says in 2 Corinthians 13, "For to be sure, he was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by the power of God. Likewise, we are weak in him, yet by God's power we will live with him to serve you." Hebrews 11 gives us real-life illustrations of what it means to live by faith. These were people who were weak, but who lived by God's power. And this is something that we are all called to do in whatever circumstances God has placed us in.